For 3 weeks, Cassie Mitchell had watched from behind the counter of Sweet Sud's Laundromat as the same puzzling scene played out before her. Every morning, like clockwork, an elderly black woman would shuffle through the door, carrying a pristine white infant secured to her chest, her body bent like a question mark as she made her way to the cleaning supplies. 3 gallons of bleach, no more no less, would disappear into her cart. The truth behind the daily bleach and the mysterious white baby would shake Cassie to her core and change her life forever. Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe. The fluorescent lights of Sweet Sud's Laundromat buzzed overhead as Cassie Mitchell arranged the bottles of detergent on the metal shelving behind the counter. 3 weeks into her new job, and she still couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider in this predominantly black neighborhood. The sound of quarters clinking in washing machines and the whir of dryers created a constant backdrop to her discomfort. This wasn't where she'd imagined herself at 23. With a half-finished business degree and mounting student loans, she'd been forced to drop out of college when her mother got sick. The medical bills had eaten through their savings, and after her mother's passing, Cassie had found herself alone and adrift. The laundromat job wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to while she figured out her next steps. The bell above the door chimed, pulling her from her thoughts. An elderly black woman shuffled in, her body hunched like a question mark, each step accompanied by a soft grunt of effort. What caught Cassie's attention first was the pristine white bundle secured in a sling across the woman's chest, a sleeping newborn baby, its pale skin a stark contrast against the deep brown of her weathered hands. The old woman's pink cardigan had a faded name tag still attached, probably from some long-ago job. Cassie squinted to read it. Montgomery. The tag looked as worn as its owner, whose arthritic fingers now struggled to grip the handle of her laundry basket. But what made Mrs. Montgomery truly stand out was her daily ritual of purchasing industrial quantities of bleach. Her joints creaked audibly as she made her way to the cleaning supplies section, each step measured and deliberate despite her obvious discomfort. With trembling hands, she reached for 3 gallon-sized bottles of bleach, the effort making her breathing turn raspy and labored. Cassie found herself counting the bottles in her head. 3 yesterday, 3 the day before, 3 every single day since Mrs. Montgomery had first appeared 2 weeks ago. The sheer volume didn't make sense. Even accounting for the baby's laundry, no household could possibly need that much bleach. She watched as Mrs. Montgomery settled into her usual spot near the back of the laundromat, her descent onto the hard plastic chair slow and painful. With practiced movements belying her physical frailty, she began sorting through her laundry bag. The contents made Cassie's brow furrow. Men's shirts, pants, and undershirts, many bearing dark reddish-brown stains that made her stomach clench. The stains weren't small either. Some covered entire sections of the clothing, and their color. Cassie had worked enough retail jobs to recognize the distinctive shade of dried blood. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Was someone hurt? Was something illegal happening? Should she call the police? But there was something about the methodical way Mrs. Montgomery handled each garment that gave Cassie pause. The elderly woman would examine each stain carefully, her lips moving in silent prayer or conversation with herself. Her movements, though hampered by arthritis, carried a sense of purpose, almost reverence. This wasn't someone trying to hide evidence. This was someone performing a ritual. The chemical smell of bleach grew stronger as Mrs. Montgomery worked, but she seemed immune to the fumes that made other customers wrinkle their noses as they passed. The baby in her sling slept peacefully, apparently equally unbothered by the harsh scent. Finally, gathering her courage, and unable to contain her curiosity any longer, Cassie approached Mrs. Montgomery's station. Her heart pounded as she drew closer, rehearsing the casual tone she wanted to strike. "Excuse me," she began, trying to keep her voice steady and friendly. "I couldn't help but notice you're buying quite a bit of bleach again today. Didn't you just get some yesterday?" Mrs. Montgomery's head snapped up with surprising quickness, her dark eyes fixing Cassie with a glare so intense it made her take a step back. In that moment, despite the woman's aged and bent frame, Cassie felt like a child being scolded for overstepping. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the mechanical sounds of the laundromat and the soft breathing of the sleeping baby. Without a word, the elderly woman returned to her task, her shoulders hunched even further, as if to shield herself from further questions. But Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this dismissal than simple rudeness. She'd seen fear flash across Mrs. Montgomery's face for just a moment, quick enough to miss if you weren't looking for it, but unmistakable once spotted. Chastened but still curious, Cassie retreated to her counter. From this safer distance she continued her observation, noting how Mrs. Montgomery's hands shook as she measured out precise amounts of bleach for each stain. The elderly woman's movements were practiced, almost clinical, like a nurse following a strict protocol. The comparison sparked something in Cassie's memory. Her mother had worked as a surgical nurse, and she'd had that same methodical precision when cleaning her scrubs after particularly difficult shifts. But these stains were different, larger, darker, more numerous, and why would a nurse need so much bleach at home? As Mrs. Montgomery worked on a particularly heavily stained shirt, something changed. Her already labored breathing became more pronounced, a wheeze entering her throat. The baby stirred in its sling, making small, mewling sounds. Suddenly, the elderly woman swayed on her feet, her gnarled hand clutching the edge of the folding table. Cassie's body moved before her mind could catch up. She vaulted over the counter, her mother's voice echoing in her head. "When someone's about to fall, you move." She reached Mrs. Montgomery just as the older woman's knees buckled, managing to guide her onto a nearby bench rather than letting her hit the floor. The bottle of bleach Mrs. Montgomery had been holding clattered to the floor, its contents spilling across the linoleum. The sharp chemical smell filled the air, making Cassie's eyes water. The baby began to cry in earnest now, its wails echoing off the laundromat walls. "Let me call an ambulance," Cassie said, already reaching for her phone. Her hand trembled slightly, another echo of her mother's final days, another moment of someone needing help she wasn't sure she could provide. "No." Mrs. Montgomery's voice was like gravel against glass, but it carried an unmistakable note of command. Despite her obvious physical distress, her eyes remained sharp and focused. "I need to replace that bleach." The request struck Cassie as absurd. Here was a woman who had nearly collapsed, who could barely breathe, demanding more of the chemical that had likely caused her dizzy spell in the first place. It reminded her painfully of her mother's stubbornness in her final days, insisting on working shifts even as the cancer ate away at her strength. "You need medical attention," Cassie insisted, her own voice stronger now. "These fumes aren't good for you, and they certainly aren't good for the baby." Mrs. Montgomery's face hardened, the lines of age and worry deepening into something like steel. "Child," she said, her raspy voice carrying decades of authority, "you don't understand what's at stake here. I need that bleach." "Then help me understand," Cassie pressed, surprising herself with her boldness. "Because from where I'm standing, something's very wrong here. The blood, the bleach, the baby, none of it makes sense." For a moment, something flickered across Mrs. Montgomery's face, a flash of vulnerability, quickly masked by determination. She pushed herself up from the bench, her movements slow but purposeful. Cassie stood her ground behind the counter, her heart pounding. The memory of her mother's final stubborn days gave her courage. "You still have 2 gallons from this morning," she said, keeping her voice level. "I can't sell you more until you explain what's going on. Those fumes just made you collapse." Mrs. Montgomery continued sorting her laundry, her arthritic hands never pausing in their methodical work. The baby had quieted again, sleeping peacefully despite the tension crackling in the air. "It's for another purpose," she stated, her sandpaper voice matter-of-fact. "What purpose?" Cassie pressed, leaning forward over the counter. "And the baby, whose child is this? Where are the parents?" Each question came faster than the last, weeks of curiosity and concern finally boiling over. The elderly woman's hands stilled for just a moment, then resumed their task with deliberate precision. When she spoke, Her voice was low but carried an edge of steel. "Young lady," she said, not bothering to look up. "My business is my own. This child is well cared for, and that's all you need to know." Cassie felt frustration rising in her throat. Her mother had always told her to trust her instincts, and right now every instinct was screaming that something was wrong. "If you won't explain," she said, forcing the words out past her racing heart, "I'll have to call the police. Child services, too. A baby shouldn't be around all these chemical fumes." The threat hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. Then, to Cassie's surprise, Mrs. Montgomery laughed, a dry, crackling sound that held no humor but plenty of defiance. "Go ahead," she challenged, finally looking up from her work. "Call them. Let them come see how this child is kept clean, fed, and loved. Let them see my house, my papers, everything in order." She straightened as much as her curved spine would allow, and despite her physical frailty, her presence filled the space between them. "You think you're the first person to make that threat, child?" Something in her voice, not just confidence but absolute certainty, made Cassie hesitate. After a long moment, Cassie reached under the counter and produced another bottle of bleach. Mrs. Montgomery nodded once, her weathered hands already reaching into her worn purse for the exact change. The routine continued as if their confrontation had never happened, but something had shifted in the air between them. The rest of Cassie's shift crawled by in a blur of coins and clothes, but her mind kept returning to the morning's confrontation. The image of Mrs. Montgomery's collapse played on repeat in her thoughts. The trembling hands, the blood-stained clothes, the sharp smell of bleach, and most troublingly, the white baby, who seemed unnaturally quiet through it all. As she began closing procedures, wiping down counters that still carried the lingering scent of bleach, Cassie found herself creating theories about Mrs. Montgomery's situation. Maybe she was running some sort of underground medical facility. Maybe she was helping injured people who couldn't afford hospital care. Or maybe, and this thought chilled her more than the others, something more sinister was happening in that house with all those blood-stained clothes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she counted out the register, the sound seemingly louder in the empty laundromat. Every few minutes, her eyes would drift to the security cameras, half expecting to see Mrs. Montgomery's stooped figure shuffling back through the door, despite the late hour. When she finally locked up, the night air hit her face with unexpected coolness. The street looked different after dark, shadows deeper, spaces between streetlights longer. Cassie pulled her jacket tighter around herself, acutely aware of being alone in an unfamiliar neighborhood. Her apartment was only 4 blocks away, but tonight each block felt like a mile. The wail of approaching sirens cut through her thoughts, making her jump. Red and blue lights began to paint the buildings ahead in alternating colors, creating strange dancing shadows on the brick walls. Something pulled her toward the sound, perhaps the same curiosity that had made her question Mrs. Montgomery earlier. Or maybe a deeper instinct that told her these sirens and her mysterious customer were somehow connected. As she rounded the corner, she saw an ambulance parked outside a modest 2-story house. Her heart skipped when she recognized Mrs. Montgomery's distinctive stooped figure being helped toward the vehicle. Even in this crisis, the elderly woman moved with a certain dignity, refusing assistance from one of the paramedics who reached for her elbow. The baby remained secured to her chest, and Cassie could see how Mrs. Montgomery's weathered hands stayed protectively curved around the infant, even as she struggled to climb into the ambulance. Under the harsh emergency lights, Mrs. Montgomery's face looked more drawn than usual, the lines deeper, the exhaustion more evident. But her eyes remained alert, scanning her surroundings as if checking for threats. Those dark eyes swept past where Cassie stood in the shadows, and for a moment, Cassie could have sworn they locked gazes. Then Mrs. Montgomery was inside the ambulance, the doors were closing, and the vehicle pulled away with its lights still flashing but sirens silent. Neighbors had gathered on their porches, drawn by the commotion. Cassie could hear their whispered conversations. "That's Montgomery's house. Poor woman. And now taking care of that grandchild too." But no one approached the house or offered any real information. As the crowd dispersed, Cassie remained rooted to her spot, staring at the dark house. The porch light was on, casting just enough illumination for her to see multiple locks on the front door and what looked like medical equipment through the window. The sharp smell of bleach seemed to seep from the very walls. The walk to her apartment felt longer than usual, her mind racing with questions. The bloodstains, the excessive bleach, the hospital equipment glimpsed through the window, and now an ambulance. The puzzle pieces were accumulating, but the picture they formed remained unclear. Tomorrow, Cassie decided as she finally drifted off to sleep, she would get answers. One way or another, she would understand what was happening in that house, with its bloodstains and bleach, with its mysterious baby, and its proud, unbending owner. The next morning dawned with an unusual delay in Mrs. Montgomery's routine. When she finally shuffled through the door, well past her normal time, Cassie noticed her movements were even more labored than usual, her breathing more raspy. Yet she carried an even larger load of laundry, her arthritic fingers white-knuckled around the handles of her basket. Cassie found herself watching. The way the elderly woman handled each piece of clothing wasn't just methodical, it was almost clinical. Her movements, though hampered by age, carried the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why. The change in her routine wasn't the only difference. Today's load contained more blood-stained clothes than ever before. As Mrs. Montgomery began sorting through them, her hands trembling but methodical, Cassie could see that nearly half the garments bore dark stains. Without waiting to be asked, Cassie brought 3 gallons of bleach to Mrs. Montgomery's bench. The older woman acknowledged this with a slight nod, her pride not preventing her from accepting this small gesture of service. "I saw you last night," Cassie said quietly. "At the ambulance. Is everything okay?" Mrs. Montgomery's hands never stopped their methodical work with the laundry, but Cassie noticed how her gnarled fingers tightened slightly on the fabric she was holding. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whir of washing machines and Hope's soft breathing. "You watch too much, child," Mrs. Montgomery finally said, her croaky voice carrying a note of warning. "Always looking, always asking questions." "Because nothing adds up," Cassie pressed, emboldened by frustration. "The bloodstains, the bleach, the ambulance, this baby." She gestured at Hope, peacefully sleeping in her sling. "And now you're here later than usual, with twice as many stained clothes." The elderly woman's dark eyes snapped up to meet Cassie's, sharp and challenging despite the fatigue evident in her stooped frame. "And why do you need to know so badly?" she demanded, her raspy voice gaining strength. "What makes my business your concern?" "Because I'm scared," Cassie admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Scared that something terrible is happening, scared that the baby is in danger. And mostly scared that if something goes wrong, I'll have stood here day after day watching it happen, doing nothing." Mrs. Montgomery's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Still, her voice remained firm when she spoke. "Fear makes people do foolish things, child, like you're doing now." "Nothing about this is foolish," Cassie countered, gesturing at the pile of blood-stained clothes. "Look at your nails, they're bleeding, and you're getting more tired each day. I saw how the paramedics had to help you into that ambulance." "Stop interfering." "I'm not trying to interfere," Cassie protested. "I'm trying to help." "Then help, I need a favor." The words seemed to cost the old lady something to say, and Cassie understood suddenly that this proud woman wasn't used to asking for help. She waited, sensing that interrupting would only make her retreat back behind her walls of dignity and defiance. "You're going to watch the baby," Mrs. Montgomery stated, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request despite the word favor. "I have business to attend to." "No," Cassie responded immediately, crossing her arms. "Absolutely not. I can't take responsibility for someone else's child. I don't even know who this baby belongs to." The memory of her earlier threats to call child services hung between them, making the request seem even more absurd. Mrs. Montgomery's dark eyes fixed on Cassie with that same unwavering intensity she'd shown during their confrontation over the bleach. Despite her stooped posture and obvious fatigue, she drew herself up with remarkable dignity. "You want answers about the bleach," she said, her raspy voice carrying a note of challenge. "Watch Hope for 1 hour, and when I return, I'll tell you everything you want to know." Cassie felt her resolve wavering. Here, finally, was the possibility of understanding what had been haunting her thoughts for weeks, but the responsibility of caring for an infant. "I don't know the first thing about babies. I might go to jail for this," she protested, but her voice had lost its certainty. "I can see you know how to keep something precious safe," Mrs. Montgomery responded, her tone softening almost imperceptibly. "I've watched you. You pay attention. You care even when you shouldn't." The observation struck uncomfortably close to home. Hadn't her mother said something similar near the end? "You care too much, Cassie. Just like me. It'll break your heart sometimes, but it's not a bad way to be." After a long moment of internal debate, Cassie nodded slowly. 1 hour, she said firmly, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Not a minute more, and I want all the answers when you return." "Everything you need to know," Mrs. Montgomery corrected, her voice rough but precise in its choice of words. Her weathered hands moved to remove the sling, each motion careful despite her obvious discomfort. The baby stirred slightly but didn't wake as she transferred her to Cassie. "Support her head, but don't worry, the sling will hold her secure, so you can work with your 2 hands," Mrs. Montgomery instructed, adjusting Cassie's hold and the sling with surprisingly gentle hands. "She's fed and changed. She should sleep." There was something in her tone, perhaps a hint of the woman she might have been before, whatever circumstances had led her to this moment. Then, as quickly as that glimpse of vulnerability had appeared, it vanished. Mrs. Montgomery straightened as much as her curved spine would allow and shuffled toward the door. Each step was measured, deliberate, showing no sign of her earlier weakness, despite her obvious fatigue. The bell chimed her exit, leaving Cassie alone with more questions than ever, and a sleeping infant in her arms. The first hour wasn't too bad. Hope slept peacefully, and Cassie managed to serve customers one-handed, trying to move as smoothly as possible to avoid waking the baby. She found herself studying Hope's features, looking for any resemblance to Mrs. Montgomery. The baby's pale skin and wispy blonde hair offered no clues, only more questions. As the second hour crept by, Hope began to stir. Small whimpers turned into full-throated wails that echoed off the laundromat walls. Cassie's attempts at soothing, everything from gentle bouncing to awkward humming, seemed to only make things worse. "Try walking with her," suggested a customer, a black young mother who watched Cassie's struggles with sympathy. "And hold her closer to your chest. Babies can hear your heartbeat that way." Cassie adjusted her hold, grateful for the advice but increasingly anxious as the minutes ticked by. Where was Mrs. Montgomery? What could be taking so long? The memory of her earlier threats about child services came back to haunt her. What if something had happened to the elderly woman? What if she didn't come back? By the third hour, Cassie was fighting panic. The laundromat had grown busier, and managing both the customers and a crying baby was proving nearly impossible. She'd already given out incorrect change twice and had a growing line of people waiting for her attention. "Can't you shut that kid up?" grumbled an elderly man covering his ears. "Are you even a mother?" asked another customer, her tone heavy with judgment. Cassie wanted to scream that she didn't know, that she'd been asking that same question for weeks. Instead, she swallowed her frustration and continued bouncing Hope, her arms aching from the unfamiliar weight. 4 hours after leaving, the bell finally chimed Mrs. Montgomery's return. Her stooped figure moved slowly through the door, and Cassie noticed immediately that her breathing was more labored than usual, her face drawn with exhaustion. Yet she carried herself with the same quiet dignity she always maintained, her eyes alert and evaluating the scene before her. 4 hours, Cassie exploded, weeks of questions and hours of anxiety finally boiling over. "You said 1 hour. You promised 1 hour. I had no idea what to do with her. I couldn't reach you. I didn't even know her name." Her voice cracked on the last word, anger warring with relief at the elderly woman's return. Mrs. Montgomery made her way to the counter, each step measured and deliberate. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on her face, highlighting every line of age and worry, but her expression remained impassive. "Her name is Hope," she stated simply, her raspy voice unwavering. "Some things can't be rushed." She reached for the baby with gnarled but capable hands. Hope's cries immediately quieted as she was secured back in the familiar embrace, turning instinctively toward Mrs. Montgomery's chest. The transformation was immediate and almost magical, leaving Cassie's ears ringing in the sudden silence. "You promised me answers," Cassie pressed, refusing to be distracted by this display of baby-whispering prowess. "You promised you'd explain everything if I watched her for an hour. It's been 4." Mrs. Montgomery's dark eyes fixed on Cassie's face, studying her with an intensity that made Cassie want to step back. Instead, she held her ground, meeting that penetrating gaze with one of her own. Something she saw there must have satisfied the older woman, because she reached into her worn purse and pulled out a piece of paper. "7 o'clock tonight, my address." Her croaky voice carried the same quiet authority it always did, making it clear this wasn't a request, but a statement of fact. The paper trembled slightly in her arthritic fingers, but she held it out steadily, waiting for Cassie to take it. "How do I know you'll actually explain anything? How do I know this isn't just another delay and that you won't harm me?" Cassie asked, staring at the offered paper. A dry, crackling sound emerged from Mrs. Montgomery's throat, something between a laugh and a sigh. "Because, child, you've earned the right to know, not with your threats about police and social services." She adjusted Hope's position in the sling, her movements gentle despite her obvious physical discomfort. "You earned it by caring enough to stay, even when you had every reason to call those authorities. Just like you care enough to want answers instead of just walking away. And hurt you? Why would I? I'm old, and you're young and strong." The words hit uncomfortably close to home. Hadn't her mother said something similar during those final days in the hospital? "You've always cared too much, Cassie. It's your strength and your weakness. Learn to live with it." The house loomed before Cassie in the evening shadows, its weathered exterior neat but showing signs of age, much like its owner. The sharp smell of bleach seeped through every crack, growing stronger as she approached the front door. Her knuckles had barely touched the wood when she heard the slow shuffle of footsteps from within. Mrs. Montgomery opened the door without greeting, her stooped frame silhouetted against the harsh interior lighting. The chemical smell was almost overwhelming here, making Cassie's eyes water. Without a word, the elderly woman turned and made her way back inside, her labored breathing the only sound beyond her shuffling steps. The home's interior was spotlessly clean, every surface bearing evidence of frequent sanitizing. Hope slept in a bassinet in the corner of the living room, and something was cooking in the kitchen, the aroma of cornbread and beans fighting a losing battle against the omnipresent bleach. "Sit, please," Mrs. Montgomery commanded, gesturing to a plastic-covered sofa. She lowered herself carefully into an adjacent armchair, her joints creaking audibly with the effort. Despite her obvious physical discomfort, she maintained the same regal bearing she'd shown in the laundromat. "You want to know about the bleach? It's for my husband," she began, her sandpaper voice steady. "He has cystic fibrosis." She paused, her weathered hands gripping the arms of the chair. "Had cystic fibrosis," she corrected herself, and for the first time Cassie saw something crack in the elderly woman's composed facade. "He passed away this morning. That's why I was late to picking up Hope in the laundry." Pushing herself up with visible effort, Mrs. Montgomery shuffled to a nearby cabinet. Her curved spine made the simple task look painful, but when Cassie moved to help, one sharp look froze her in place. The older woman pulled out a photo album, handling it with reverence. "This was James 2 years ago," she said, showing Cassie a picture of a tall, thin man with a bright smile despite his obvious illness. Her arthritic fingers traced the edge of the photo with a tenderness that made Cassie's throat tight. "The past few months have been the hardest. Every breath was a struggle. The infections kept coming back, stronger each time. She turned another page, her hands trembling but determined. Cystic fibrosis fills the lungs with thick mucus, trapping bacteria. Each infection leaves scars. Each scar makes it harder to breathe. Her voice, though still rough, carried the weight of years spent fighting an unwinnable battle. "The bleach," Mrs. Montgomery continued, her croaky voice taking on a harder edge, "wasn't a choice, it was survival." She closed the photo album with careful precision, but her gnarled fingers remained resting on its cover. Every surface had to be sterile, every piece of clothing sanitized. The smallest infection could have been fatal. She looked up at Cassie, her dark eyes fierce with remembered purpose. "When he coughed up blood, I had to make sure nothing remained that could harbor bacteria. It became more than a task. It became my mission, my way of fighting against what was killing him." Rising slowly from her chair, Mrs. Montgomery made her way to a shelf lined with medical supplies, nebulizers, oxygen tanks, and boxes of surgical masks. Each item was meticulously arranged, spotlessly clean. "The doctors told us to be careful about infections. They didn't understand that careful wasn't enough, not when every speck of bacteria could mean another hospital stay, another round of antibiotics, another scar in his lungs." Her raspy voice caught slightly, but she pressed on. "This morning, James lost his final battle. His lungs simply couldn't fight anymore." The words were delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone she used at the laundromat, but Cassie could see how her shoulders hunched further under the weight of them. A soft whimper from the bassinet drew both their attention. Mrs. Montgomery moved to check on Hope, her movements automatic, despite her obvious exhaustion. As she adjusted the baby's blanket, Cassie noticed how her hands shook less when handling the infant, as if some reserve of strength remained specifically for this task. "I'm so sorry for all this. I didn't have the slightest idea," Cassie said. "And Hope?" she asked softly, watching the tender interaction. "Where does she fit into all this?" Mrs. Montgomery's face hardened slightly, her jaw setting in a familiar expression of determination. "My daughter's child," she stated, her voice reverting to its usual commanding tone. "Sarah was in a car accident 3 months ago. She's in a coma." She paused, her expression growing darker. The father disappeared the moment he saw his newborn daughter, walked out of the hospital without a backward glance. "The social workers," Mrs. Montgomery continued, her croaky voice taking on an edge of steel, "were ready to put her in the system, came to the hospital with their clipboards and their concerns." Her weathered hand remained protective on Hope's bassinet. "Said I was too old, said I had too much on my plate with James, said a baby needed more than an elderly woman could give." She straightened as much as her curved spine would allow, and despite her physical frailty, her presence filled the room. "I told them they'd have to fight me in court first, showed them my papers, all in order, proved I could provide for her, made them see that blood means something, even if it's not the same color as your skin." Moving to a chair near the bassinet, she lowered herself carefully, her joints protesting audibly. "Even with James so sick I couldn't let her go. She became our reason to keep fighting. James—" For the first time, her voice wavered slightly. "James loved watching her breathe. Said it reminded him of what his lungs used to do, easy, peaceful. No struggle, no weight, just pure, clean air." Mrs. Montgomery took a deep breath. "But I'm 73 years old, my husband is gone. My daughter might never wake up." She looked down at Hope, and Cassie saw something she hadn't expected. Not defeat, but a clear-eyed recognition of reality. This precious child needs more than an old woman's determination. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication but free of self-pity. Mrs. Montgomery stated these facts with the same unwavering authority she'd shown in all their previous encounters. She wasn't begging for help. She was laying out the situation as she saw it, with the same precision she used when measuring out her bleach. Cassie found herself moving before she could think, drawn by something in the older woman's voice. Not weakness, but a strength that acknowledged its own limits. "Let me help," she heard herself say. I know I'm young, and I know I'm just the girl from the laundromat, but I can help with hope. We could do it together." Mrs. Montgomery turned her penetrating gaze on Cassie, studying her with the same intensity she used when examining stains on James's clothes. "You don't know what you're offering," she said, her raspy voice carrying no judgment, just stark reality. "This isn't just babysitting. This is taking on a burden that isn't yours to bear." "I know about burdens," Cassie replied, thinking of her mother's final months, of dropped classes and mounting bills. "And I know about choosing to carry them anyway." The older woman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. "Tell me why," she demanded, her croaky voice firm. "Not your pretty words about helping. Tell me the real reason you want to involve yourself in this mess. I don't have the money to pay you." Cassie felt the weight of that stare, remembering how it had intimidated her at the laundromat. But now, surrounded by the evidence of this woman's years-long battle against illness and loss, she understood it differently. This wasn't just scrutiny, it was assessment, the same careful evaluation Mrs. Montgomery had applied to every threat to her husband's health. "Because I've been watching you for weeks," Cassie said slowly, choosing her words with care. "Watching you fight battles I didn't understand, with nothing but bleach and determination. And now that I know what you've been fighting, what you're still fighting, I can't just walk away. My mother taught me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you." Mrs. Montgomery's hands tightened, her arthritic fingers working against the worn fabric. "Your mother," she said, her voice suddenly knowing. "She's gone, isn't she?" "Cancer," Cassie nodded. "She fought until the end, just like your husband did. Just like you're doing now." A long silence filled the room, broken only by Hope's soft breathing. Finally, Mrs. Montgomery pushed herself up from her chair with a grunt of effort. Her movements were slow but deliberate as she made her way back to Cassie. "The house is spacious for just my granddaughter and me," she stated. "That apartment of yours is no place for a young woman to live alone. Besides," her eyes flickered to the bassinet, "I could use a little help with taking care of a newborn." The next afternoon, when Mrs. Montgomery entered the laundromat, something had changed. Her stooped frame and labored breathing remained the same, but there was a different quality to her movements, as if some of yesterday's weight had been set aside. Hope slept peacefully in her sling, tiny fingers curled against the worn pink cardigan. She approached the counter, her dark eyes meeting Cassie's with their usual directness. "Just one load today, so one small bottle would be enough," she said, her raspy voice carrying a note of something that might have been peace. "Hope doesn't make nearly the mess her grandfather did." Cassie felt the significance of this request. Not 3 gallons, not even 2. One small bottle. The need to clean was beginning to loosen its grip. She reached under the counter and produced the bottle, noting how Mrs. Montgomery's gnarled fingers wrapped around it with less desperation than before. As she made her way to her usual spot, Mrs. Montgomery paused. Without turning around, she spoke, her croaky voice carrying across the nearly empty laundromat. "There's a place down the street, Mama Pearl's Soul Food, best cornbread in the city." She adjusted Hope in her sling before continuing. "Your mother would have appreciated a good meal. We can go for dinner later. And here—" She grabbed something from her pocket. "Your room," she said, pulling out a key. "You'll need to get in when I'm not there." Her dark eyes held Cassie's gaze. The house has rules, everything clean, everything in its place. Some habits don't change even when their reason is gone. Cassie took the key, understanding what wasn't being said. The bleach might be reduced, but the need for control, for protection, wouldn't disappear overnight. "I can work with rules," she said simply. The autumn sun painted long shadows across the laundromat floor as Cassie prepared to close for the day. Mrs. Montgomery sat at her usual station, but today she wasn't hunched over blood-stained clothes with bottles of bleach. Instead, her gnarled fingers worked at folding a small pile of baby clothes. As Cassie locked the register and gathered her things, she watched Mrs. Montgomery slowly rise from her chair, Hope secure in her sling. "Ready?" Mrs. Montgomery asked, though it wasn't really a question. Stepping out into the evening air, Cassie found herself reflecting on how much had changed in the past month. She remembered her first days here, feeling like an intruder in this neighborhood, watching this mysterious old woman with her suspicious purchases and unexplained bloodstains. Hope stirred in her sling, and both women reached automatically to adjust her blanket, their hands meeting in the practiced choreography they'd developed. The baby had become their bridge, the reason for their unlikely alliance turning into something deeper, a shared purpose, a mutual understanding. "You're thinking too loud," Mrs. Montgomery observed, her croaky voice carrying a hint of amusement. "James used to get that same look when something was weighing on his mind." "I was just thinking about the bleach," Cassie admitted, earning a sharp glance from the older woman. "About how sometimes the things we think will keep us safe can become a burden themselves." Mrs. Montgomery was quiet for a moment, her shuffling steps steady against the sidewalk. "Some burdens," she finally said, her raspy voice thoughtful, "are lighter when shared. James taught me that. And now I'm learning it again." They paused outside Mama Pearl's, the warm light from its windows spilling out onto the darkening street. The smell of cornbread and collard greens wafted through the air, replacing the sharp scent of bleach that had dominated their lives for so long.